Henri Blumberg will tell us about a rather peculiar personality of Joseph Hirshhorn, which was mentioned in the previous lecture. He came from Mitau to the United States, and what he will be, how and what will he had became, we'll hear now from Henri Blumberg.
It's a pleasure to be here again, and thank you for inviting me. The building that you see was dedicated to the work of Joseph Hirshhorn, and the building itself is as much an attraction outside as anything inside. It looks like a spacecraft parked on the National Mall in Washington, and essentially the building is an open cylinder elevated by massive legs with a large fountain occupying the central courtyard. When the architect designed the building, he was told that he had to provide a striking contrast to everything else in the city. Only then would it be fit for housing a modern art collection. And so you can see the building itself is in striking contrast, whatever else you will find at the Smithsonian. In thinking about Joseph Hirshhorn, he must be seen as a culmination of an archetypal American life story. He had, as it were, come, as some people would say, from nowhere and began from nothing. So, looking at the outside, you can see it is very different to what you would see at the Smithsonian for those of us who've been there. When, however, you look at some of the work, you see here, for example, a massive sculpture of the Burghers of Calais by Rodin. These were one of 6,000 pieces of art that he collected. And that is 6 times more than what is actually shown in the museum itself. So it is known also as the Hirshhorn Sculpture Garden and Art Gallery. Henry Moore is very well represented there, and he particularly liked Henry Moore because he felt, like himself, he was plain and direct in his ways. The work of Picasso, Dora Maar, again, Hirshhorn became friendly with many of the prominent artists of his day, and quite a number of Picassos were bought by him. The Miro work, the lunar bird, is also outside the museum itself. Then, this particular one by the artist Louis Elchemis, Train Landscape in Arizona, maybe exemplified the fact that Hirshhorn, I think, was sympathetic and sensitive to the suffering of others. And he felt that he had a particular fondness for Louis Elchemis, the American painter whose long career of failure and sickness was one of the most poignant in the history of the country's art. Of course, some people would laugh when you hear that he was sensitive to the suffering of others. There was one, of course, exception, and those were his rivals in business. To his rivals in business, he showed no sympathy. No collection, of course, would be complete without works of Chagall, and here is one called The Bible. And then, how could one possibly have anyone from Latvia who does not have a Mark Rothko in his collection? And here, number 24, 1949, by Mark Rothko, as well as a Mark Rothko called Blue, Orange, Red, 1961. Looking at the outside of the gallery, looking at the inside as well, we have to ask ourselves, where did he really come from? He came from Jelgava, Mitau. He was born in 1899, and he was the 12th of 13 children, quite an achievement in itself. Tragically, his father died when he was very young, and his mother decided to go to America. So they came from Mitau, and what particularly interested me, as I'll explain later, is where he came from, particularly in Mitau. This particular road, Katholische Straße, has significance for me as well and for my family. And these were pictures of Mitau at the time. Now, the family left, but as we all know, going to America was also a very daunting task. They arrived in America. She did not have enough money. The mother did not have enough money to bring the whole family, so Joseph was left behind for a short while. And when they arrived, her brother-in-law was supposed to meet them at the docks, and things happened. He did not arrive, and they felt stranded when they arrived. Fortunately, they were let in, and inexplicably, she never found her brother-in-law again, or saw him again. Joseph came over when he was 6 years old, and there's a sort of anecdotal story told by his daughter, Jean Hirshhorn Lapierre, and she says that when he came over steerage, he was leaning out from the deck, and somebody from first class above him saw this little boy and threw him an orange. Well, he was pretty deft, and he caught the orange, and he'd never seen an orange before. And the gentleman asked him to come upstairs to first class, and he then spent most of the time on the trip being in first class. And the story was then retold and retold by the family that Joseph always liked to travel first class from the age of 6. When they arrived in America, his mother worked in a factory earning $12 per week. But what was a horrific experience were 2 fires that took place and affected them. The one was in Williamsburg in 1908, when the tenement they were staying in was destroyed, and their lives were saved. But it was a very, very close shave that they had to jump out of the windows, or otherwise they would have been burnt. And that created a marked impression on the family and Joseph. The second major fire was a Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in 1911. You may have heard of that factory and the fire. It was the worst fire that took place in a factory in New York. And Ella and Frida, his 2 sisters, worked in that factory, earning $3 per week in the sweatshop. That is a picture of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And In that fire, 146 people, mainly women, were burned to death. The factory was located on the 8th and 9th and 10th floors of the ash building, and the owners had locked the doors to the stairwell and exits. It was then apparently a common practice to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks or to avoid theft. The result of the fire was it led to legislation requiring improved factory conditions and standards, and things were tightened up considerably. Tragically, the fire engines could only reach to the 6th floor. So the result is the people on the 8th floor really had no chance whatsoever, and that is why so many people lost their lives. Now one would ask, well, what significance was this to the family other than that it was a horrendous experience? But where it made a very big difference was that Amelia, his mother, felt that if any one of the children should tragically die, she would not have enough money for the burial. And sometimes one asks oneself, what is the motivating factor that drives you to do something that is quite unique? And here I would say it was the two fires. So Amelia went along and went to see a person from the Prudential Insurance Company. And she bought a burial policy. And every year, the man from the Prudential, they used to call them the man from the Pru, used to come around. And he would give them a calendar. And on the calendar were paintings. But they had no money to buy any works of art. So the result was that Joseph, every month, as the month came to an end, would tear off a painting and put it on the wall. And that is how he began his lifelong delight and pleasure in art. And he dreamt at that stage that he would be able to one day buy paintings like that. But of course, it was one of those dreams that seemed completely impossible. He was only 6 or 7 or 8 years old, and what chance was there that he could ever do anything like that? Anyway, Jean Lapierre wrote the story of what her father, Joe Hirshhorn, had said. He said, "My mother had insurance on all of us. Every Saturday evening, the Prudential man came to the house to collect his money. Once a year at Christmas, he brought a calendar with beautiful pictures. Every month, I couldn't wait until we tore off another page. I used to cut up those pictures and hang them on the ugly green walls in the bedroom where I sleep with my brothers, and on the walls of the other rooms where I could look at them every day. Those calendars were the first art I had seen. They excited me, and I wanted more. It intrigued me. I think this is how my art world started." And from there, he decided, obviously, he'd like to do something to make money to be able to collect and to take his family out of the poverty that they were suffering. So he couldn't finish high school, and at the age of 14, he managed to get a job working in a stock brokerage firm. And it was said that by the time he was 17, from an initial investment of $250, he accumulated $168,000 by the age of 17, which was, in those days, when we're talking, approximately the 1920s, we're talking of an enormous amount of money. However, in 1929 came the stock market crash. And A few months before the crash, he decided to sell out completely. He was a millionaire at that stage. And he decided, well, where do I invest my money? He felt in America things were too precarious. And he felt that there was one country that would be a safe haven for investment, and that was Canada. And the one area of Canada that impressed him was in resources. So here, a young man who had no formal education became a connoisseur of art and bought virtually at an incredible speed. He was buying art with virtually all the spare money he could lay his hands on, and he was buying art constantly. He became an astute financier. And when he got to Canada, he thought resources is where the next future for him lay. And he studied geology. And he came to the conclusion that in Canada, in Ontario, uranium was available. There was only one problem. They knew there was uranium, but they couldn't find it. It sounds strange that they found samples, they found everything, but they could not find where the uranium was. And he was able, with others, to find that it was under what was known as the Cambrian Shield, the massive rock formation stretching over thousands of kilometers of Canada. And under that thick shield lay uranium. And he staked the claim to this. And it was reported afterwards that the mine that he found in Algoma was capable of producing more uranium than all of the more than 600 uranium mines in the United States together. That gives you an idea of the incredible find that he brought to the surface. So he became an enormously wealthy man, having found the biggest uranium mine basically in North America, if not in the world. And at the same time, he was collecting and collecting. And by pure coincidence, I found the intersection in my own life that my father's family also came from Jelgava, also from Liepāja, but my father went to America, also worked in a factory. He was a cutter before he went to South Africa. Hirshhorn's family worked in factories, and then Joseph Hirshhorn went to Canada. I also landed up in Canada, and he had an office on a road called Bay Street, which is the equivalent of the Wall Street of Canada, and so is my office in Bay Street, purely fortuitously, and it's only one block from where his office was. Of course, I'm not in the same financial position, and I know nothing about mining. Anyway, he collected this enormous treasure trove of work. And the question was, what was he going to do with it? He wasn't in it to make money. He wasn't in it to sell. He wanted to give it to somebody, to some organization, to some country that would look after it. The English were very, very keen to get it, and they were going to build a large museum for him in Regent Park area. And he was wined and dined, and he was on the verge of doing a deal with him to give the whole collection to England. But then he felt, it's wrong. No, I must keep it in America. Then he decided Canada is the place I should make a big donation. And as politicians can be very, very short-sighted, one of the politicians turned it down. Then he came along and said, well, Israel. And Israel was very keen, but they did not have the money to build a museum or to sustain the upkeep of a museum. So that didn't really work out. Then Italy came along and they said, we'd love your Italian collection. And they were really keen to get the Italian collection. He went over there and he was about to sign, giving them the whole Italian collection, when they showed him this magnificent palazzo where they were going to house it. And he asked a simple question: how do I get there? There's no proper road. And they said, oh, well, you know, they'll get there. Well, they couldn't. There was no road. And then they told him, by the way, when you bring the collection here, you've got to pay import tax. So he said, you mean I'm bringing my collection, I'm giving it to you, and I've got to pay tax on importing it? And they said, yes, of course. Well, that killed that one. Well, eventually, he managed to do a deal whereby it was housed on the Smithsonian Institute's grounds, and Lyndon Johnson sort of mastered it through. And not everybody, of course, was in favor of it, because there was the war, they needed money for war, and they didn't think that this should be something that they wanted to put their money into. And this collection, he was very broad-minded in this. He did not want the collection to be stagnant. And he told his trustees they could sell anything they wanted or exchange to keep it alive and current. And that is why, in many ways, it's still become a living entity. What has been fascinating to me, and why I chose this topic as opposed to other prominent Latvian Jews who emigrated, was because of what I call the Blumbergs and the Hirshhorn, and the putting of the dots together. And Arlene, who I'm very happy to see here, will appreciate that once you're a genealogist, you can't very often help looking at things through a genealogical eye, no matter what it is. So it all started, really, and I must say that's where it started, and some people will recognize here Rita on the left and Bella, Rita on the right and Bella on the left. And from that photograph of my uncle in Jelgava, it went further. I had to find where the shop was, and I found the shop. That's where it had been originally. But those who know Ed Anderson would know that what he did in Liepaja genealogy. But he contacted me and he said, look, you know something? Somebody's writing to me from Los Angeles, a Hirshhorn, and maybe you should contact them. So I met the person, and it turned out she was a second cousin, and she gave me a photograph. You can see the same gentleman there was my uncle. The only photograph I have of my grandmother, and I met her, Minna Reichert, and she was a Hirshhorn, and that is why I felt impelled to talk about Joseph Hirshhorn. Now the question was, when you do some genealogy, you always would like to find somebody in the family who was prominent. So I was invited to the Hirshhorn reunion, and they called me an honorary Hirshhorn, although I would have rather been just an ordinary Hirshhorn, not so honorary. But anyway, and that was Jean Hirshhorn, and that is Joe Hirshhorn's daughter. And there, my wife, myself, and Jean, a photograph of the reunion. And there, just Joe Hirshhorn with Pablo Picasso, O'Keeffe, President Johnson, all of these various photographs festoon the wall. And in looking at the Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust, we'll see many Hirshhorns on that list, but there were also, mixed up with that, many Blumbergs. And in Grobina, there's a memorial also with many Hirshhorns and Blumbergs on this, because we were sort of intermarried. And there, to cut through it all, my great-aunt's nephew was Joseph. So the closest I could get to him was through my great-aunt and her nephew. And it's not a direct lineage, but it's better than nothing. And where does all this lead? His contribution was not only for the present, but for the future. So here is a picture inside the memorial, or rather inside the museum, and that's my granddaughter. And that is Joseph, done by Larry Rivers, one of the artists he really admired. In real life, of course, he didn't look like that, but that was Larry Rivers' interpretation. And that is the legacy and the gift of Joe Hirshhorn, who gave this enormous collection, which in today's money would probably be worth billions of dollars to America and to all art lovers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a very, very interesting presentation. And I want to thank you for sharing with us your genealogy problems, getting inside of a less famous family, because to myself, Blumberg is much more important than Hirshhorn. Because, you know, my wife comes from Blumbergs, also from Kurland. So thank you very much. Now, whether anybody has question to our lecturer? Есть вопросы к докладчику? Если вопросов нет, то мы поблагодарим еще раз Хенри Блумберга не только за то, что он сделал нам такой хороший доклад, но и за то, что он поддержал организацию конференции финансово. Благодарим его еще раз. И в 5 часов собираемся сюда на торжественное открытие конференции, 10-й конференции, юбилейной конференции евреев в меняющемся мире.